So today we're going to go over the federal budget process and then delve into the executive branch activities, congressional activities, other considerations that we have in the budget process, and then a quick update on where we are in the process for fiscal year 2023. To get started, why should you care about the budget process? Understanding federal discretionary dollars is critically important because you need to know how much your target federal agency can spend. Every year, Congress's priorities dictate what each federal agency spends their money on. So if a government contractor's product or services could be great, but if the money is not allocated for that product or service, then you will not be able to sell it to the federal government. So this should be like the first step when you're looking. And understanding when the money is spent during the federal fiscal year is also critical. So from about October to March, we have the executive branch process, which I will go over in a second, and April through June, the legislative process, and then July through September would be Congress finalizing the spending levels.
I'll also point out this chart over here on the bottom left. Discretionary spending is a relatively small portion of the federal budgetary pie. So you'll see 2/3 of that spending is made up by mandatory spending. And at the time of the creation of this chart, interest payment on the national debt was 8%. That number will continue to go up. So barring huge increases in the federal budget, the discretionary spending allocation will continue to decrease. So it's important to know exactly where those dollars are going to maximize your access to opportunities.
So there are technically 14 steps in the budget process timeline. This is rarely followed to step by step, but there is a formal timeline for the appropriations process, which is determined by the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. So if everything goes according to plan, how it should be every single year, this is what that timeline would look like. But again, this rarely happens in a smooth flow chart type of way. So from July to February, like I just mentioned, is the executive branch, where federal agencies and the Office of Management and Budget go back and forth drafting and revising drafts until OMB compiles the final budget. And then the president submits the budget request to Congress. And then from March to June, we have around the legislative process where the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee are reviewing the request and coming together to find a budget resolution. At which point from July to October-ish, we would have Congress finalizing the spending levels, where there are 12 House and 12 Senate appropriations subcommittee hearings and markups, where the House and the Senate each reviews, approves, and votes on these budgets until finally the president signs it into law and we have a budget. And there are 3 budget processes happening concurrently at any given time. So for fiscal year 2023, we have agencies currently spending their appropriated funds for 2022, where all one-year funds will expire at midnight on October 1st. Fiscal year 2024 is agencies are finalizing justification materials for fiscal year 2024 to submit to OMB in January 2023. Passbacks and budget justification hearings are to follow. And then fiscal year 2025 is the internal discussion of and preparation for fiscal year 2025 budget requests is already underway in many cases and being talked about.
And before we jump into the executive branch process, I want to highlight something that Haley just said. In the FY23 budget process, that is not a typo. So as Haley said, this process should occur in this order on this timeline. In the last decade, 15 years, it hasn't any given year. So currently, agencies should be spending FY23 appropriations. We don't yet have FY23 appropriations. We'll delve into that process a little bit later. So they are still spending at the same level they were allocated for FY22. All that to say, the process is very complicated and doesn't always happen on time and in order. And we'll dive into some of the reasons as to why that is.
Yes. So first we'll get into the executive branch activities in that first section of the process. So after about 6 to 18 months of planning, federal agencies submit their budget proposals to the Office of Management and Budget for review. In these agency budget justifications, there's information such as previous accomplishments and funding priorities, a detailed description of each program activity and its purpose, and explanations of proposed changes for the next fiscal year, which are often focused on the increase or decrease of spending that might be happening. The president determines what the administration will support, and then OMB notifies agencies of the president's directives and guidance through what we call passbacks. From there, agencies incorporate revisions and submit final requests to OMB, which may or may not be included in the final PBR, President's Budget Request to Congress. And you can typically find these types of documents under the About page, under the Budget and Performance on each agency's website. Next, I'll go over the President's Budget Request, or PBR. This is developed by OMB and plays three important roles. One, it tells Congress what the president recommends for overall federal fiscal policy. It lays out the president's relative priorities for federal programs, not only for the coming year, but for the next 5 years or more, thinking on a longer term as well as the immediate year coming. And third, it signals to Congress what spending and tax policy changes the president recommends. So the PBR generally consists of a budget, historical tables, analytical perspectives, and appendix. The budget of the U.S. government includes a short message summarizing the president's policy priorities, summary tables of budgetary aggregates, and narrative descriptions of proposed government activities. The historical tables provide an overview of federal government finances, including historical data on budget authority, government receipts, outlays, and the federal debt. Analytical perspectives contain an in-depth discussion of government programs, a technical explanation of the budget baselines that were used to produce the estimates contained in the president's budget. And lastly, the appendix includes detailed budget estimates and financial information on the individual programs listed by appropriations account, which includes the president's recommended appropriations language, among other information. This information can be found on the White House website under the OMB webpage. And our last part of the executive process here is the Defense in Future Years Defense Program, the FYDP. So in addition to the standard budget materials, the Department of Defense also develops this program to where it projects the department's anticipated personnel, resource, and program needs in future years. These numbers are typically updated based on final PBR figures. And our current administration, or the Biden-Harris administration, is taking what it calls a 3 FYDP approach, where in May 2022, Deputy SecDef Kathleen Hicks said the first FYDP, the one spelled out in the fiscal 2023 defense budget request, deals with the here and now threat, Hicks said, while 2 FYDPs away is the objective force. What's taking time to plan is how you get from here to there.
It's important to note the Future Years Defense Program, you also hear abbreviated as the FYDP, is a 5-year program. However, anything that is included in a current year's FYDP, be it for FY24 or FY28, can be pulled forward into the current fiscal year. So you'll see a lot of anticipated programs fleshed out in the FYDP, potentially coming on into play earlier in the process than this might suggest, just because of the way DoD uses the FYDP to gain authorization for these new programs. So with that, let's jump into the congressional side of the House. So the president's budget request is complete. It's been sent to Congress. Congress now is beginning its process of working through the budget request and getting through those authorization and appropriation activities. So the budget resolution is the first step in the process, as Haley mentioned at the beginning. This is where the House and the Senate are coming together to essentially agree on what that budget should look like. Traditionally, this is due on April 15th. This almost never happens by April 15th. Sometimes there is no congressional budget resolution at all. So in years when we have a full year continuing resolution, which we'll get into in a little bit, you won't see a congressional budget resolution passed at any time. When that happens, like I said, you're going into special procedures to set different spending levels or do a continuing resolution. There's whole other processes that kick off. Important to note, however, it includes 19 broad spending categories known as functions. So these are going to be everything from Department of Agriculture to Department of Energy and Nuclear programs. All of these things will show up in the budget resolution. Defining the difference between authority and outlays. So authority is how much an agency will be allowed to spend. Outlays are how much they actually spend. So the example provided here, if a bill appropriates $50 million to build a bridge and it gives $50 million in budget authority for that coming fiscal year, it's unlikely that those $50 million will actually be outlaid in that fiscal year. It's likely to extend maybe 2-3 years in the future. So it's simply a difference of what's been allowed versus what's actually been spent. You will also see discussion of 302A and 302B allocations. These are committee allocations, spending totals laid out by the budget function. They're distributed by congressional committee rather than these Script 19 functions. So once we have a budget resolution, we move into appropriations and authorization bills. These two things are not the same. So an authorization is going to be more policy focused. So things like creating new departments, doing restructuring, setting new procurement rules. We'll talk about the NDAA here momentarily as one of the largest authorization bills. These authorization bills will sometimes provide ceiling amounts of appropriations to be spent. But none of these bills actually funds the government. That is where appropriations come in. So appropriations are the actual dollars out the door that allow the government to complete a variety of functions to meet their mission. So appropriations are passed by subcommittee. You'll see the list of subcommittees on the right-hand side. They're going to cover only the funding for the things that fall into their subcommittee and then come together, and the whole of Congress will pass each of these appropriations measures. Now, like I mentioned, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, this is a lion of a bill that has to be passed every year to authorize Department of Defense spending and other related national security activities. So this will be nuclear activities at the Department of Energy, similar activities that are happening in other departments. So this does authorize the top line spending for the Department of Defense and those programs, but it's also going to be a lot of other policies and restrictions that are going to come into play in the NDAA. Particularly for those who do business with the federal government, you will see a lot of laws, regulations, rules, procurement reforms happening through the NDAA. So particularly for GovCon, this is of huge importance to know what's being passed in the NDAA and what's been included. This doesn't provide any budget authority. It's typically just a policy bill. But it will give you a fairly good idea of how Congress is feeling about defense spending and what you might expect in the appropriations process. If this is interesting to you, like Haley said, we're going to do a deeper dive on this, the history of it, what's behind it, the process, all of that will come out in March. So keep an eye out for that if you'd like to get more in depth on the NDAA. I apologize for the squeaking dogs behind me. So other things to think about, like I mentioned, continuing resolutions. So the timeline Haley showed you, we should have full appropriations ready to rock and roll on the first day of the new fiscal year, which would be October 1st. That almost never happens. Instead, what we have usually on October 1st is a continuing resolution. So what a continuing resolution does, it's set up for a specific period of time, and it authorizes the government to continue spending at the same levels as the prior fiscal year. So currently we are under a CR. That CR is set to expire on Friday. I'll jump into that a little bit more in the where we're at update. However, what this means is agencies have the same amount of money they had in FY22. They're essentially keeping the lights on and the doors open. However, they are not allowed to start new programs. So particularly for things like national security functions where needs are evolving constantly, we have emerging threats. This really hamstrings the government because they're not able to address anything that is new, anything that has happened since October, anything that emerged in September. They can only do what they've already been doing until they get full year appropriations. We have, in some cases, had continuing resolutions that extended through an entire fiscal year. So we never at any point had full appropriations for that fiscal year. Everything was kind of at a standstill. So the government doesn't like CRs, industry doesn't like CRs, but this is a stopgap measure that prevents the government from going into full shutdown. Now, other considerations in the budget process. Those of you who have been in this space for a while are likely familiar with the Budget Control Act, or the BCAA, of 2011. This was an Obama administration initiative aimed at reducing the federal deficit. So what this did was put in place statutory spending caps that outlined the absolute maximum the government was allowed to spend in a given fiscal year. So this had significant implications for the budget process in Congress, knowing that these ceilings were in place. You'll see the table on the right shows several updates that occurred that shifted these caps. So the bold numbers are the ones that were adjusted with each subsequent piece of legislation. Outlays did decline over the 10-year period. So in some ways, this was effective. However, this is no longer in play. So Congress is not dealing with these sorts of caps when they're going through the budget process as of now. CBO is projecting a steady increase in discretionary spending through FY32. The federal deficit continuing to grow. I'll talk about the debt here momentarily. This remains a significant concern. So while this piece of legislation is not in play anymore, it's entirely possible, depending on the administration, that we could see something like this in the future. So it's a good thing to be aware of and to understand what those implications are for the government and for industry that supports the government. Now, like I said, the national debt. The debt ceiling has been in place since 1941. What this does is restricts the Treasury's ability to pay on financial commitments that Congress and the president have made. So essentially, they have authorized spending at a certain level. The Treasury has to make outlays to meet those authorized spending commitments. The Treasury is not allowed to do that when it involves exceeding the debt limit. So if we go above the debt ceiling, what this starts to look like is causing the government to default on its debt. If this were to happen, there would not just be economic consequences here in the United States. These would extend worldwide. So this would be a huge, huge, huge financial challenge for every country in the world if the US were to default on its debt. Obviously, that is in no one's best interest. So the current debt limit is set at 31.4 trillion. You'll see that figure on the right. That is as of December 7th. You can go to that debt to the penny website and it will show you a live count of what that debt looks like. But with only $50 billion remaining to spend against that debt ceiling, expect this to be a very prominent issue for Congress in 2023. Funding the government past middle of next year will require significant action in this area. So it's something